So when I first started doing interpersonal, I came out of teaching argumentation and public speaking. And if you've ever taken any of those classes, it's like there's very specific stuff. It's kind of structured, you know, fallacies. This is the format you put things in. And I was afraid I wasn't going to be able to do interpersonal communication because it's all that touchy-feely stuff. And they said, you have to lecture on emotions. And I said, really? Doesn't everybody know about emotions? And guess what? Not everybody does. So here we go. Richard Weaver defines emotion as felt tendencies toward stimuli. There's your technical word choice. And in his case, felt tendencies are internal, now this is key, physiological reactions to your experiences. So emotions are rooted in physiology. They are physical reactions. They're not just things that happen in your brain, they are things that happen in your body. So physiological reactions here. And you feel those, and that creates your emotions. Now, Beebe and Beebe call it a biological, cognitive, behavioral, and subjective affective reaction to an event. That means it's a reaction to a stimulus. So here they say, yes, there's definitely biology going on, so it has to relate to the physical aspect. There's physiological aspects here. Cognitive, meaning it occurs in your brain, right? Behavioral results technically in some behavior of some sort. Something happens because of it. And that it is subjective. It depends upon your viewpoint how you respond, right? So we talk about categories of emotions. We specifically talk about facilitative and debilitative emotions. What I want you to notice is it's not that there are good emotions or bad emotions. They're facilitative or debilitative. So facilitative are those emotions that contribute to effective functioning. They help us get things done. They help us cope. Debilitative are the ones that keep us from feeling and reacting effectively. So, love. Would you agree that love is an emotion? Okay. All right. Could it be a facilitative emotion? Yes. Yeah, it can be. Can it be a debilitative emotion? Yes. So, it's not a good or a bad emotion. It's whether it helps us function effectively or interferes with us being able to function effectively. So then what makes the difference between the two of them is intensity and duration. When love becomes a debilitating emotion, it's when it's taking over your whole life. It's a lot more intense. Even in the early stages of a romantic relationship, it can interfere with your ability to function effectively, couldn't it? Okay? If you can love someone without it taking over your entire life. And in fact, most relationships, that intense love, it doesn't fade, it changes, right? So that it coexists rather than takes over. And duration, when I think about duration, I think about the phrase, revenge is a dish best served cold. Have you ever heard of that one before? What does it mean?
If you want to act revenge on someone, you want to be, thankful or you want to hurt them cold. You don't want your dish. You want a dish, you want it to be warm. That would be good. So you serve a cold dish.
See, that's not what it really means.
Somebody wrongs you, you wait until time and anger is dissipated.
Because they're not thinking about it, so that you get your revenge upon them when they're not expecting it. So you are holding a grudge. It's of long duration, right? Revenge is a dish best served cold. I want to get you when you're not expecting it. and you're expecting it right after you've wronged me. So I want to lull you into that complacency. Right? How many of you have seen Maleficent? Or Maleficent, excuse me, that's the way it is pronounced. Okay, I went to go see it this last weekend. Doesn't it kind of make you think of that movie here? The way she held on to this negative feeling about Aurora, and then after a while it kind of changed and it no longer took over her life. Does that make sense? Those of you who haven't seen it know enough about it to know what I'm talking about, right? I haven't given anything away. She is the bad queen, or bad, right? You guys know that. Okay. We also talk about primary and secondary emotions. Primary is the first emotion that you feel. So primary means first, right? And secondary can be caused by the primary emotion. So fear could lead you to becoming nervous. Fear could lead next to horror, right? So what the primary emotion, the first emotion you experience, and that will often trigger additional emotions, and there would be your secondary, and then by extension tertiary emotions, right? Because they can build upon each other. Now, Robert Plutchik came up with this model of emotions in 1980. And I'll start off by saying right now, I'm not sure that I 100% believe or agree with it, but I think it is really an interesting thing. He says that we have lots of emotions on here, right? So these are general, universal emotions in his mind. There are 8 of them. That you can combine them, for example, acceptance and fear would combine to be submission, that you would blend those. And the other argument is that anything that is opposite, acceptance and disgust, you cannot hold those 2 emotions at the same time. I know, like I said, I'm not 100% sure I agree, but it's an interesting concept, right? And that you can blend those, basically the intensity. So if you have grief is much more intense than sadness. So here's sadness here, here's sadness here. A more intense emotion is going to be grief, and a less intense emotion is going to be pensiveness. So it's just kind of an interesting, different way of looking at emotions. Yes? Thoughtful. You know, kind of sad, but not really sad. You're thinking things through. So loathing, disgust, and boredom. I don't know that I would think that boredom is less than disgust. But like I said, that's just a piece of information. And I'm not sure, could you experience anger and fear at the same time? I think you could. So I'm not 100% in favor of this one, but it's still worth going. So what are the components of emotion? Well, first, here's that word physiological, that there are physiological changes that you feel, or may not feel, but there are changes that occur in your body. Where are my nursing students? I know that there's several in here, 1, 2, 3 of you, right? Proprioceptive, have you heard that before? You will. Proprioceptive changes are the changes that you can feel in your body. So an example of something that is not a proprioceptive change is your blood pressure. When you have high blood pressure, you don't necessarily feel it unless it's really, really high. But you can feel your heart rate go up, right? You can feel sweating. So the things that you can feel are the proprioceptive stimuli. Did I even pronounce that right? I think I did. Now, nonverbal reactions are those that people can see on the outside. Some of those can be physiological changes. Like if you sweat, you can feel the sweat, and sometimes people can see you sweat. Sometimes they can, depending upon how observant they are and how hard your heart is beating, they can see your heart rate, but not usually. So your nonverbal reactions. And sometimes it could even be that you do a behavioral nonverbal reaction, right? As we're cold in here. And then the cognitive interpretation says that your mind will then interpret and apply a label to it. So, man, I'm sweating. I must be nervous. That you put a label on it. And that label is really important. So there's lots of theories about how this works. There's the common sense theory, which says, hey, emotions happen. Something happens, it causes an emotional reaction, and that causes a physiological reaction. I find out I have to do a speech, I'm nervous about doing a speech, my heart starts beating faster. It should have already been beating. You have the James Lange theory, which says it's got the same things in here, but these two are switched. That a stimulus happens, your heart starts beating as a result of that, and that creates your emotional reaction. And by the way, I've not seen any support one way or the other which one of these is right. These are just different theories. This last one is kind of interesting. It's the appraise and label one. It says a stimulus happens, it causes a physiological reaction, we label that response, and then we experience that emotion. So you get assigned a speech. Your heart starts beating rapidly. You say, wow, I'm nervous, and then you experience nervousness. Now, for me, the key here is I don't know which order this one or this one comes into, but I can say that how you label the response will affect how you perceive what you are experiencing. Does that make sense? So there's a theory as well that thoughts are then at the core of our behavior. Something happens. We think about that. That creates a chemical reaction in our body, which causes the emotions, which causes a physiological reaction, and that can then contribute to another event, meaning that you can definitely spiral your emotions. Yeah, the nursing students in here can probably understand that a whole lot better than me, because I tend to combine the chemical reaction, the physiological reaction in my brain, but you know that that's not the case, right? That there are chemical changes in our body that cause physiological reactions. So how do you interpret your emotions when you are experiencing it? Well, first, you want to pay attention. And this is where we don't do this in real life. We just kind of go with it. We don't engage in what's called self-reflectiveness, which is the ability to pay attention to things while they're occurring. So here you want to pay attention to your facial expressions, your vocal cues, your posture, your gestures. You want to pay attention to what's going on. So your facial expressions and vocal cues will help you figure out what kind of an emotion you're feeling. And then your posture and gestures deal with the intensity. For example, I can't believe this is happening, versus I can't believe this is happening. You know, the much more bigger gestures tell you how intense it is. What can influence it, obviously, is culture. If you're looking at somebody else and you're trying to determine whether you're understanding their emotions well, if you are of a similar culture, then you're much more likely to be accurate at that. So remember, we talked stereotypically about communication apprehension, and that in the Asian culture tends to be of higher apprehension levels. The Asian culture tends to be higher in their ability to interpret nonverbal messages. Minor things show up. If you are Asian and you are communicating with somebody else who is Asian, you're going to be much better reading their emotions than you are if you are Asian communicating with somebody who's African American, or somebody who is white, or somebody who's Hispanic. Culture. Okay, now culture, by the way, is not the same as race. It's culture. So if you're in a different culture, it's better if it is a static image, meaning you look once and go away. Not a surprise. Women tend to be better at interpreting emotions of others. Is that a big surprise to you guys? No. And accuracy definitely increases as we mature, as we get older. No big surprises there. I just changed the battery. Okay, emotions are contagious. We don't think of it sometimes, but they are really contagious. Good emotions and bad emotions, or facilitative and debilitative emotions. How do we catch emotions? There's a theory called emotional contagion theory. It says that there's two possible ways that you catch emotions. When you frown or smile, we get into the physiological stuff. Okay, when you frown or smile, the way your face moves changes the muscles, all that kind of stuff, does the blood flow. And then you have a physical reaction because of the chemical change in your body, because when you smile, it does something different in your body than when you frown. So there's that possibility. The second thing is much more psychological. So this first one is physiological. This one is psychological. That says when we smile, for example, we remember other things that were happening when we smiled. And that creates an emotion because you remember all the good things that occurred when you've smiled. And then when we frown, we remember all the bad things. So we link those feelings with particular expressions. Yes, could be very much muscle memory. Not the way I normally think of muscle memory. Muscle memory is when you do things without even thinking about it, right? Did anybody, by the way, go home and try that Ian's knot after I showed you in class how to tie shoes? Just curious. Because the hard part is changing the habit, because you have muscle memory to do certain things. So there are wanted emotions and unwanted emotions, right? There's times that it is appropriate or you want to feel what somebody else is feeling. And there's times you don't want to feel like somebody else is. Particularly anybody work in an environment that is really toxic, a toxic work environment, you don't want to catch those emotions. So how do you avoid catching those unwanted emotions? Well, first is you need to be that self-reflective person. You need to pay attention to how you feel around other people. Think about it when it's occurring. And then after you pay attention to it, that's when you label your emotions. And then this is the key part. You need to ask yourself if what you're feeling is because you potentially caught it from the other person or because you really feel that way. Because sometimes you really feel that way and you can't blame it on the other person. But if you figure out that you've been catching the mood from that other person, then you can choose oftentimes not to respond or not to let it change. Well, or you change where you go. Yeah, you can try that where you have somebody try to catch your positive emotions. But more importantly, somehow, just oftentimes knowing that you're catching that emotion is enough to stop you from getting it completely or understanding what's going on. But if you're around Aunt Sally and every time you're around Aunt Sally you feel pretty negative, well then perhaps you want to limit how much time you spend around Aunt Sally. Now obviously in some situations it's not going to work. You have no choice. I asked about the toxic work environment, but you may have something that you can do with that. And by the way, money is not everything when it comes to having a job. The economy is improving now. If you are in a toxic work environment, you might want to think about changing your work environment if you can't change the way the environment is operating or how you're responding to that. Has anybody ever experienced this? Okay, I am making less money now. I'm still making good money. I'm a good professor, right? I'm making less money now than at one of my jobs before I became a professor. but I'm a whole lot happier and it's worth it. So how do you control our emotions? The first is you need to learn to relax and learn self-control, and then you've got to pay attention to other people's emotions. Now, the learn to relax, this is something I got a problem with. Who has a hard time relaxing? It is really hard. You've got to figure out a way to relax. Now, I need to get back into yoga. For me, yoga made a huge difference in how I felt in general. It allowed me to relax. And when I stopped going to yoga, because life got in the way, it always does, I could feel a real big difference. And it wasn't just in flexibility. It had to do with how I was able to handle my own emotions. So figure out how you relax. And preferably, you shouldn't make it a chemical way to relax. Learn self-control. This is a key here as well. You are in control of your own emotions and how you respond as a result of those emotions. Oftentimes, we give other people the responsibility associated with those emotions. In other words, we say, well, you made me do this. You know how to push my button. Yes, but you allowed your button to be pushed. When you say that you're not responsible, you've given everybody else control over your emotions. Now, this is really nice to say, and you're all nodding your head going, uh-huh, but it's a lot harder to put into practice. And then if you read other people's emotions, then you'll be able to be much more effective at controlling your own emotions. So here's some guidelines. Again, I think all this is common sense. But common sense is not very common. And sometimes just having it spelled out means you'll think about things a little bit differently. So the first is you need to recognize your feelings. What are you really feeling? And then you want to choose the best language for that. We tend to be what one of my colleagues calls linguistically lazy. When we are feeling good, we're happy. When we're feeling great, we're happy. When we're feeling contented, we're happy. We use the same word a lot. And particularly when it comes to negative emotions, for me, I'm pissed off. Well, you know what? Sometimes I'm not really that pissed off. I may be frustrated. But there's a difference between frustrated and angry and pissed off, right? We just don't. There are differences there. There are gradations there. And we tend to use the same words consistently. So choose the best language to describe how you are feeling. If you have mixed feelings, so you have your primary emotion that leads to the secondary emotion, you can share that. Or remember Plutchik's model, even though I don't necessarily agree 100%, I do like the fact that he shows that two together can create a blended feeling. So you can share that. Recognize that there is a difference between feeling and acting. Research shows that most people have at some point in their lives considered committing suicide. The thought has crossed their minds. Just because that's what you feel like doesn't mean you have to do it. Please. I can tell you there are times I feel like quitting. Or I feel like walking away from my kids. Well, you know what? There's nothing wrong with feeling that. The question is what you do as a result of that. And sometimes it's appropriate to walk away from your kids. Accept responsibility for your feelings. That's that self-control. The other person doesn't have responsibility. You have responsibility. Choose the best place. If you're going, and this is a big if, just because you're feeling some way doesn't mean you have to express it. But if you're going to express your emotions, you need to choose the best time and place. Which means you've got to think about this. You don't just react, you think before you react. And then now it's time to figure out how you're going to say it. means there's planning involved. Yes?
I feel like that's implying that like this particular feeling is like negative. Like I feel like if it's not a negative feeling, then you shouldn't have to think about it. So
Oh, you still have to think about it. You've got to figure out the right way to say it.
but not as I feel like in this sort of situation, it's more referencing like an argument or some way that you're upset, like you said, like with your kids walking
Okay,
away.
how about when you really care for somebody and you're afraid by disclosing what you're going to say, it might cause them to think of you differently or misinterpret it?
That's like that's like a one-time deal. Like on a daily basis, though, like in daily interactions, like expressing your feelings should be like very much something that everybody does and they don't. They're not comfortable.
I don't know. I don't necessarily agree.
Like at work, and you're like super excited for something, like, but that might not be an appropriate place to like completely just be like, oh my god, I'm so excited, like
Express your feelings about being there.
Or somebody else's,
but you
or,
are excited.
well, how about if I,
It's not a job and the person that like if I was up like in an audition and one of my friends was going through the same part and I got the part,
That's-
I'm excited, but I can't be like woo, because they're just gonna be like, what is wrong with you?
That's not often. Like that doesn't happen to you every
I didn't say it happened often, but when you do,
every day.
but when you do need to express your feelings, you've got to be clear about it, which means you had to think about what you're feeling. I can't stand it when I'm talking to somebody or I'm talking to somebody about my emotions, and I say, I don't know what I feel. You're trying to talk to them, you don't even know what you're feeling. All you know is you're feeling something. So this is saying you got to figure out what you're feeling before you talk to them. That's all. Positive or negative. I mean, all right, that should be it, I think. There you go. Okay. Let's see if I can stop this recording.